Hello and welcome to the first of our podcasts on the wisdom of Shakespeare. We are really excited and frankly quite privileged to be joined for this by Sir Mark Rylance. Mark is one of the most distinguished actors of his generation, and to read his CV would take the rest of this podcast, frankly. But let's just say that it's the kind of CV that every actor, when they go to drama school, dreams they might one day have. I think Kirsty Young said when he did Desert Island Discs, Tonys, BAFTAs, Olivier Awards, he's got the lot. And since then, he's won an Oscar for the Spielberg film Bridge of Spies. And he's played many, many distinguished roles in the UK theatre and in New York and around the world, and also on TV and in movies. But my intro to Mark is a little different from that. I remember some years ago now, 25 years ago, Mark coming to see The Glass Menagerie, in which I was playing Tom in the West End. And he came backstage afterwards and invited me to audition for the Globe. I was very keen to do that, and the Globe was just opening, and we were all really curious about what it would be like. And I remember I went along for my audition at the Bear Gardens, because the main Globe wasn't built then yet. And any actors watching this will know that a day like that is quite nerve-wracking. You're meeting someone who's quite a distinguished figure, and you really want it to work out. And I needn't worry, this guy in a Hawaiian t-shirt and a pork pie hat came shooting down Bear Gardens and parked up his bike, and then came up to us all and just went, "Hey, I'm Mark, as if we didn't really know who he was. And then we all went in, and Jack Shepherd was running the audition because he was directing Two Gents, which was the first production at the Globe, the prologue season. And Jack Shepherd wanted to do a number of improvisations. And Mark sat with us, the actors, on the floor and did all the improvisations with us. And at the end, he asked for feedback on what could be better in the audition process and what they could learn about helping the actors with auditioning for the Globe. I'd never seen anything like this, and I was very impressed. And it was an early leadership lesson for me of the kind of leader that I wanted to work with. So, Mark, it's a real pleasure to have you here, and thank you for doing this.
Oh, the wonderful things we forget, huh? What a great memory of that day. I can't remember it, but
you did quite a few of them, I think, at that time. So there's no real reason why you would.
Yeah.
I'm going to start by asking you something that I remember you're speaking to me about during that season, and that you also spoke to my colleague Richard Olivier about, which was the idea that there is a great mythic story, or even perhaps teaching, at the heart of the Shakespeare plays. Could you say a bit more about that and your own perspective on that idea?
Yes, it's a very good question. And one I stumbled upon. I didn't go to university. I just went to a technical college to train to be an actor. But I always had a gift. I don't know where it came from, for Shakespeare. It never seemed foreign to me, and it always attracted me and seemed to express things that I couldn't find words for. And anyway, my fortune led me to be playing Hamlet at the Royal Shakespeare Company at 28 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I've played it before at 16. Actually, I was lucky, but at this time, playing it 8 times a week, there were some evenings that worked more powerfully than other evenings, and I became very fascinated about making adjustments. And when you're in a leadership role, as you know, the people watching this and the work you do with leaders, you know this, you can have a large effect on the group. When the group gets together and unites, they have an even larger effect on you. But as a leader, you are asked to look forward and to make adjustments. And in a role like Hamlet, or any of the leading roles, you know, whether you shout or are quiet, or whether how magnetically distant, how magnetically removed and confused you are as a character, how active you are and electrically charged to be driving things forward. These make a huge difference to the evening. You can literally, I can remember taking 20 minutes in time off a performance just by speeding up and being more certain and active. So anyway, I started to make lots of adjustments. And very fortunately at that time, on a dark evening after the theatre it introduced, in a way I won't go into, but it was an interesting moment of how we often meet great guides in darkness or in chaos or in confusion. It really is, or in a desert. It really is in my life the occasion when guides have come forward. And I met a man called Peter Dawkins, and he started to introduce me to some of the underlying philosophies and ways of thinking in the Renaissance when Shakespeare was being written, when Shakespeare was writing. It was like our time, a time dominated by a collective kind of agreement and cosmology and thought form about what reality is. And that thought form, which was primarily Christian, was divided, like in our time. Most things are divided. And the elders around Shakespeare would have experienced a very violent division between Catholicism and Protestantism, and indeed humanism, which was moving out to Protestantism. This would come right down as it now would be existing, I imagine, in Bosnia or in places that have had recent civil war. And they were looking, so there were. But there were many at that time who had been inspired to look back to the ancients, to the classics, to Plato and to the Greeks, to really look back as far as they humanly could, even to the Egyptians. And if they could have looked further back, they would have looked further back to find out where was there a time where we were united before we got so divided. It's a natural thing to do, even in a family, even in a person. When did I get divided like this? Did it begin at age 7, at 18? Did it begin when this terrible trauma happened at 27? So they were looking back, and they were finding very interesting descriptions of the soul in Plato, and this idea personified by the god Hermes of every individual having a characteristic which they called the soul, which was a messenger between the gods and humanity or the earth. So it was a messenger between what was palpable and physical and part of the time and space here on earth, and what was larger, archetypal, non-visible, but perhaps where thoughts and dreams and other things came from, perhaps where life manifested, that there was some kind of essential state in the universe. Lately, interestingly, I heard from George Monbiot, the environmentalist, the other day, that they're thinking that all forms of species, I don't know if you've heard this, Ben, that all species on the earth have an essential bacteria buried underneath the surface of the earth, clinging to a rock. Sometimes as deep, he said, as 40 kilometers, that actually the species all emerge from bacteria. And until that bacteria goes, the species is not necessarily done, even though it may appear to be extinct on the surface of the earth. That's very interesting, isn't it? And like a kind of one of the phrases or distillations of this philosophy in the Renaissance time was a statement, as above, so below. And this is an example of there being something physically essential to our species, as well as the Greeks would say something invisibly essential, archetypal, something emerging from a non-physical, non-time place. The soul later, interestingly, Freud and Jung, as you all know, did the same thing as these Renaissance artists. They looked back to find out descriptions as they were trying to work on the birth of psychology. And indeed, that word psyche, they found to be an embodiment and a manifestation in story of the soul. And so psyche is another word for soul. And indeed, Mercury became the Roman term for Hermes. This philosophy, which became to be known as the Hermetic philosophy, I find, and Peter led me to explore it, and I found it very, very useful, and something that underlay Shakespeare. And it came to me to help me to understand why Shakespeare had such universal appeal. I would meet people who translated Shakespeare not only into Italian or Russian, but into Zulu. And still they would come to the Globe when we did international seasons and say Shakespeare was a Zulu. Because how could he not have been a Zulu? He understood us so well. So even if you take away the brilliant craftsmanship of the words, the rhythm, the rhyme, the use of prose and poetry, if you the topical references to English history, English plants, if you take away all that stuff that we as English men and women enjoy, people still feel it connects with them. So there's something underlying, something essential in the work that is proven to connect pretty much to individuals, at least in all languages of humanity. I think you could say that.
It's something that I've heard a lot in the work we do in traveling around the world, and in some of the work I've done also working in education. Kids from all over the world saying, we think Shakespeare's ours. He's not, he's not just English. I remember kids in Argentina saying, we think Shakespeare's Argentine, but of course not possible, because at that time it hadn't even been discovered by the West, or by Europe. But I wish
we could think that Maradona or Messi was English.
Was English, yeah. If we could get them their papers, it might. I don't know if Maradona would be much use to us now, but we could still sign up Messi for the next World Cup whenever it happens. That would be very useful. But this internationalism about Shakespeare is undeniable. I mean, the productions are done all over the world. It's obviously it's partly his amazing vision and ability as a writer, but it's also something more in the realm that you're touching on. That there's so much I could ask you about this, and it's in a way hard to know where to start. But certainly in our work, we found that there are certain characters in Shakespeare who seem to be far more aware of higher purpose and of what we might call a greater worldview, a view that encompasses far more as to the nature of humanity and what we are here for. And then there are other characters in Shakespeare who are very retractive and defensive and very, very strongly ego-led and very interested in their own private interest. And Shakespeare, this seems to be a big, big theme in the Shakespeare plays, as to that level of awareness to what a human being's purpose might be.
Yes. It's something that he addresses, and it's something interestingly that I've got a lovely hummingbird right next to me now. It's something that that the Greeks were trying to address as well, and they recognized there was a difference to loving a thought, understanding a thought, and experiencing a thought. That if someone says, would you please drive slower, I've come to understand that driving at 40 miles per hour over the speed limit is a little dangerous. Yeah, I know, thank you very much for the advice, backseat driver, you think. And someone says, I really love driving a bit more slowly. That has a little bit more effect, but it's not. But if someone says, listen, I had a car accident on this road, or a road very much like this at this speed, and there was no way I could see it coming, please drive more slowly. You're going to slow down. Experience is an amazing teacher. So they had this thing called the Eleusinian mystery schools, which were designed to create experiences for the audiences, experiences that would if you experienced it in lifetime, might kill you or damage you or leave you very wounded. A character like Hamlet goes through a series of experiences. By the time he's gained the wisdom from those experiences, the karma of what has happened to him catches up with him, and he has to die before he can live for a long time as the king that he has become, in terms of what he's learnt and his understanding of how to be a king. But in an Eleusinian mystery school, you can live through that experience with Hamlet, gain that wisdom, with experience and not be dead at the end, but step out of the theater, out of the mystery school, and be a better leader. It not only for other people. Whenever I'm talking about this, I'm sure you understand, I'm meaning also in terms of our own archetypes within ourselves, the king within us, the queen within us, the prince, the emerging new leadership that's emerging inside of us always and struggling and can see something without, because the prince doesn't have the responsibility that the king has, the lover, all these different archetypes, which so excitingly OMA are moving into now as a new form of teaching. And these can be very well applied and can be useful ways of looking at the Shakespeare work. So yes, the what is our purpose? What is our function? What is our role? And working on the Shakespeare plays, looking for them for what is essential and trying to deliver to the audience an essential rather than a reduced interpretation. That became important to me because I could feel in the theater on certain evenings something very, very essential happened. Something quite almost like making electricity or something. And it wasn't just in the mind. This is a very important thing with Shakespeare, that the intellectual aspect of Shakespeare is so strong that he's become surrounded by a whole camp, fortresses and castles, and a whole civilization of intellectual love for him. But that, to my mind, has obscured some of the very brilliant stuff that the author employed wisely: sensuality, beauty, emotion, the visceral nature of these plays. They're written to be experienced and be heard, not just understood. That's not that I'm against understanding, but really the power of them can be experienced even when you're at a performance in a language you don't understand. That's my experience. So we have to be careful about just putting them in the suburb of academia and intellectual understanding. It puts a lot of young people off. It's something that you know, Pythagoras, one of the other teachers they went back to, said we have to develop the lover, the soldier, and the what was it, the thinker, or the there's another word for it, the philosopher or something like that. But there are three aspects to be developed, and they're all equally important, so that we're not fearful of physical pain, for example, and we love the physical world. We have an understanding of the intellectual world, and very importantly, that our hearts are able to love, and we have an understanding of the power of emotion. So when you talk about there being different characters of different consciousness in the plays, yes. And interestingly, when I first fell in love with all this consciousness, you know, of Hermetic philosophies and Renaissance stuff, I thought, well, I'm going to create a production of the Tempest, and everyone's going to be conscious, and we're going to do this in the roll right stone circle and get the energy from the land, and it's going to be amazing. and interestingly, that play has 4 groups who all have a very different consciousness. The butler and the cook and Caliban, who spend most of their time circling the island looking to kill Prospero and rape his daughter and get drunk very quickly on a bunch of bottles of liquor they find, and lead a very sensual life, very, very amusing, not necessarily bad characters, but they just are living in the physical world. They're not very loving. They feel powerless, and they're seeking power. That's a very particular consciousness. And interestingly, those actors, when times got hard and it rained every day in June, all they really wanted to do was get to the pub quicker and get some food. And they were very, very useful, very, very important group, you know, because I would just press on, and playing Prospero, I had this inspiration and stuff, and I needed them to bring me back to anchoring it and giving people a break. The lovers fell in love. The lords, who are very smart and talk about classical things, got into the authorship debates and all kinds of intellectual arguments. So it became clear to me that a consciousness was not about everyone being conscious or the whole of your body being conscious. It was about you having a consciousness of very different consciousnesses in your body, and each of them being valid, each of them as above, so below, that there isn't, that in the eyes of the Great Spirit, there isn't greater love for one or the other. So this seeking of consciousness mustn't be just a climb towards the light. It has to be a hike where we also are very good at coming down the dark side of the mountain and being in the wood. Yeah.
Let me press you about that, Mark, because that's a theme that obviously we've been thinking about a lot. These are very, very challenging times for many, many people facing enormous adversity, and some showing enormous courage in the face of adversity and tremendous service. This has struck me a lot in recent weeks, amongst the many other things that we witness with it, as a very Shakespearean theme. And those characters who, under tremendous transformational pressure, including often enforced transformation, which is agonizing at times, Lear's madness, Hamlet's despair at the loss of his father, there are Leontes losing Hermione, and Hermione's death and then resurrection within that story, that there are those characters who, in the face of crucial difficulties, move to an opening to service, and others who look to a great hoarding of protection of what is theirs. And that's beautifully seen in the Tempest, where some characters just grab what they can and they're just there for the material gain they can get. There are others working at different levels throughout that, and Ferdinand and Miranda are kind of like great young initiates moving through that process. And even Prospero himself realizing there are aspects of my power and rough magic, as he calls it, that I need to surrender, that I have used to control others, and that ultimately there are levels beyond that where I surrender that control and allow what needs to emerge to rise. This happens in Lear. Lear undergoes a tremendous transformation that drives him to madness, but then at the end of it, there is a wisdom and humility in him he never had at the beginning. This is a huge Shakespeare theme. You've played Prospero, you've also played Hamlet. Is this something that you've sensed in playing the characters and in working at the Globe, for instance, that people are awakened to this theme and can almost viscerally feel it at moments when it happens in a play?
I agree with you, Ben. I certainly find service very, very moving. It's one of the most moving things I see happen between human beings. The sometimes spontaneous growth of the self to include the other. I think it's interestingly one of the reasons that war carries on, because I think a lot of men experience in war an ethical intimacy, is what the wonderful James Hillman called it. An ethical intimacy. It's a time in their life where they will risk their lives for their squadron, for other people, sometimes people they don't even know, and they meet in the chaos of a battlefield, and they will witness this and do it themselves. And it's very hard in life for them to get an experience like that outside of the battlefield. And it leads to great grief after battle. And I think it's why one of the main reasons why war is very difficult to stop, even though it's so clearly rationally destructive and not a way that we resolve things in the family or in our workplace or in any other place. Service, it's really that what's coming to me today is that this it's like a spontaneous combustion or a breaking down of the Berlin Wall, or it happens in life at certain moments, in crises particularly, where suddenly our definition of ourselves, the boundary of who we are and what is other than us, breaks down and crumbles and disappears, and we go, that person, this community, this tree or this landscape, this animal, this little child, that is, I care about that as much as I do myself. There is no separation between my survival and the survival of that other being. And that's something that is a very, very, that's, I think, quite a common aspect of Shakespeare's plays, something he the author, also loved and celebrated. And all the leaders, even this incredible leader, Prospero, who has what modern technology promises as us, what science promises. We're being promised it now with the idea of some vaccine that will protect us from corona, that he has a mastery of nature. He can bring his enemies on a storm and land them on his island in his control in separate places, and he has them in his power. And even that power he gives up at the end. Shakespeare has him give that power up and break this staff that he has and this book of knowledge, which has enabled him seemingly to master the elements around him. And he does that, and he forgives these people who have been very, very cruel, sending him and his daughter to their deaths out on a little raft like refugees crossing a huge ocean. We see so much of that at the moment. Perhaps we are, that's an interesting reflection, that these plays are so wise. I feel like they were written for generations that were to come, not only for Shakespeare's time, but the idea of writing something essential, doing essential work. We all want to build a building or make a company or have a child, don't we, that is going to last and live and be something beneficial. And so this this present situation of refugees in the world casts us, the powerful in the first world, very much in the role of this king and and his advisors and the son, and indeed Prospero's brother Antonio, whom the play ends with him forgiving. And this wonderful phrase, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine." Now, darkness is very important because we've had so many centuries of white being beautiful and dark being not so beautiful. To be clear about what darkness means, darkness is just a place where there's no light. So there's no form. There's no. It's a chaotic place where you can get lost, where you can't. Your intellect and your mind can't make shapes and patterns and paths, and you can't even read a map. You can't even see your friend standing right next to you. You might not know you have a friend standing right next to you. So there are many, many levels of darkness. You could be in the brightest lit neon office space and be in total darkness. I'm sure many of us have experienced that. Actually, sometimes the darkest feelings are in the most sunny day and most bright place, aren't they? So to acknowledge that darkness as our own, as not an other, or something to be lit even, but certainly something not to be dominated, but that it's our own. It's something of us. That's a very profound thing. I'll just finish this by saying that I can put to that it's particularly profound for Shakespeare because it's very clear that he probably wrote The Tempest very late in his career. And yet when the Shakespeare plays are first shared with the world in their totality in the folio, Shakespeare folio 1623, he places it right at the beginning. So he's not putting the plays into that folio, or whoever puts them into the folio, in the order of when they were composed. There is a sense of revelation, like a good poker player or bridge player revealing their hands. And The Tempest is right there, almost like an index or an introduction to the whole work. It's a very, very philosophical and profound play.
I'm reminded in what you say, Mark, of a quote of Jung's, where Jung said, "The aim of all therapy is to make the darkness light." And it's a very Jungian concept that we can only do that by acknowledging that and by recognizing that in ourselves. Obviously, we cannot recognize that we're not conscious of by definition, but to be able to broaden the depth of our consciousness and see what emerges from that can be very primitive, that can be very Caliban-like, because Prospero says that about Caliban, and to be able to absorb that into ourselves rather than deny it or suppress it in that very Puritan way that was a pressure within Shakespeare's time, that means that those energies go unfed and unmet and then can really overwhelm us and can really destroy us if we're not careful. This Shakespeare theme, I want to ask you a little bit more about this to do with transformation. There's a Jungian analyst, an economist called Alan Mulhern, who has done some terrific podcasts about what he calls the quest, and I recommend them to people who are watching this. And there's something he says in one of those, which I also thought was very linked to what you're talking about here, not just in the Tempest, but potentially in Henry V before Agincourt, with Lear, in Hamlet, in many of the plays. Mulhern says, it is a common observation that individuals change most when they face their traumas fully, honestly, and harness their energies to affect fundamental change. And what interests me in that is that's great, but it's unbelievably hard to do. And it's often great crisis that brings it to us. And in Shakespeare, for instance, the night before the Battle of Agincourt for Henry, we see that crisis. And with Lear, we see that crisis. And Hamlet is driven to a point of crisis. I wanted to ask you, Mark, in playing these great characters, how did you work on the kind of heart opening that happens within them to make them what we would argue in our work, far more substantial leaders, people who were much more empathetic and open to those they work with and serve? In working on those characters, did you sense that shift in them? How do you play that shift within them? And can you remember viscerally what any of it felt like or any of its response on your audiences?
This takes work. It is very hard. You're absolutely right. And I'm hesitant to speak because I'm critical of a lot of the performances I gave, that I wasn't able to be there as much as I would like to be. But I was always struggling to learn how to be there more, and occasionally experienced it. I think this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. This thing of chaos, of actually befriending chaos. I've known some very clever people, and interestingly, one thing that strikes me is they seem able to be in chaos longer than I am. And I wonder that about Einstein or someone like that. If you knew him, that actually had a greater capacity to sit in the compost heap in chaos than the rest of us. The rest of us would panic if we had that many contradicting theories and numbers and ideas going on. We'd panic, have a nervous breakdown. But some people who have very new ideas and grow and change and introduce something very new, I just wonder how much that is to do with learning to sit in the chaos. One of the great classrooms I would go to in a university would be a huge room of compost, and you'd have to go and sit in there for 2 hours or longer every day. Just sit there and smell the shit and become comfortable with chaos, pointlessness, meaninglessness, rotting, death, really, that ultimate darkness of death. Because most of these Shakespeare characters go through this thing and do this thing the Spanish called duende, a nearness to death, an association with death. You hear it in the early songs of Dylan, an obsession, Bob Dylan, an obsession with death. Many making a friend, or this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. And so the ability in performance, and I would maybe say in leadership of companies or of yourself, not to panic when things get chaotic and there seems to be a death of an idea or a state of being, or something, that not to panic and try and move immediately to the light. Here I would question a little bit Jung urging us to move always to the light. But I would lean a little bit more to the yin-yang symbol and a balance of light and dark and shade. But I think that I was always looking for ways to be really confused on stage, to not be certain. That was a quality of life that people, only very, very anal and kind of over-controlling people are always certain, give the impression they're always certain. I would doubt that they are really certain. Who can be certain about, we don't know what's going to happen next. Life's what's happened while we're making, life is what's happening while we're making plans. And so you would think a rehearsal or a creation of a play should be about planning the best way to present it. You know, now we'll move here. You say that in that funny way you did 2 weeks ago in rehearsal. That'll get a laugh. Then I'll go over here and we'll block it all out. I think people imagine that's how plays are created. You learn the lines and then you say them. You think the best way to say them. And I was always trying to unlearn things and trying to be present, and really be present. Not even trying to repeat the brilliant performance that happened yesterday when everyone cheered and everyone laughed and the other actors came up to you and said that was the best performance you've ever given. Even that, let it go. Who wants reheated food in a restaurant? You want something cooked fresh. You want it straight from the farm and on your table, fresh, and it's just been cooked at that moment. So that was always the teaching that had led me and inspired me to try and, so on that dark night of the soul in Henry V, to really try and take on board that situation, and the experience in Henry's mind, the realization that perhaps as the leader, the divine leader at that time of his nation, it was his job to have a massive failure and for many people to die because something had happened. The murder of Richard II by Henry's father that had a karmic effect and was having a bad effect on the whole nation, and he needed to pay the bill for his father's life, and that was what he had to do. Now, we might question that, but, you know, and if you look at it literally, if you look at myths literally, you get yourself tied in knots. But if you look at it metaphorically, we do all, as children, pay our parents' bills. I am paying the bill for my grandfather's lack of ability to father my father and mother. My family right now during this corona crisis, one of the main things we're dealing with, interestingly, is the stuff that's coming up for my brother and my sister and I, because of the lives my parents led, because of the lives their parents led during the Second World War in Japanese prisoner of war camp, and that, you know, so it's talking about a very real thing in a very dramatic form, like you would go to a pack of tarot cards to get a reading about your life, kings and princes and princesses and soldiers and stuff. What does Shakespeare have that character of the king, which is in each of us, King Henry V, do? He has him disguise himself. This is really interesting. I was thinking about your questions before we came here. How often in chaos these characters disguise themselves, protect themselves with a disguise so that they can enter a situation like a surgeon putting a glove on to do an operation, or a robot hand being used when you have to go in and clear out some toxic chemical waste in an area. A certain disguise, a certain masking. That's so interesting. You see, last night I dreamt about disguises, knowing that we had this conversation coming up. The psyche is so curious. But Henry disguises himself as a common man. He puts on a cloak and a hood, and he goes amongst the common men without them knowing that their leader, their king, who can say we will retreat or we will attack, is amongst them. And he hears a truth that his leaders, his advisors, wouldn't have the guts to tell him and might not even think. And it's at that moment that this incredible phrase, going back to our first question, is said that every man's duty is the king's, every man's soul is his own. That's one of the most revolutionary, radical things that isn't the whole Shakespeare canon. So wait a minute, Queen Elizabeth would say, you mean that this author is saying that the people don't need me to appeal to God on their behalf. They don't need the Pope. They don't need any of you priests. They don't need their father, their mother. They don't need people, that any elder person. You mean anyone? Not quite anyone, is it? Every man. Is he including women? Some people at that time didn't think women had souls. I think Shakespeare proves in his writing that he doesn't agree with that. But that anyone, every man's duty is the king's. Every man's soul is his own. Every man's soul can have a direct connection to the divine. And the play is demonstrating that at that moment by these three men not being aware that the divine king, Henry V, is amongst them and hearing them. And he's there through disguise. So there's something about play acting, about taking on a character, taking on a lie, actually, taking on a falseness in order to find the truth. That's very interesting. Where did Henry V learn this? From one of the greatest drunks and fat men ever conceived, Falstaff. So you can't really separate Henry V from the Henry IV plays. And he does this at great risk to his position. His father and the authorities around are very, very concerned about him hanging out with these thieves and liars. Wonderful liar, Falstaff, the most wonderful liar I've ever come upon, and sensualist. You know, but that's where Henry learns some skills. A really important skill at this crisis moment comes from this wild and unruly and deceptive friend in his childhood. So that's a very interesting thing too, that using pretend can be done ethically and very, very positively. We also get many examples in Shakespeare, don't let me give the wrong impression, of people pretending and lying for awful means. Richard III, Iago, many different people destroy other people's lives. So this is a very, very powerful tool, pretending and lying and seeming to be what you're not. But it's also a very positive tool, and it leads Henry to a very, very honest piece of leadership, which is not deceiving his army that they're going to win, but saying that it's very possible that they're all going to die, and if any of them wants to go home now, they can, which I believe he means.
This is an issue that does strike me as, I don't think we can ever see Shakespeare as being Jungian, but I often see Jung as being very Shakespearean in some of his ideas. And yeah. The idea that in order to enlighten oneself, one has to be growing down as well as up. The idea that we can escape the darkness, not that we do not acknowledge this thing of darkness as being mine, but we escape the dirty darkness and we go into an elevated sense of moral virtue, is incredibly dangerous, it seems, in both Jung's eyes and in Shakespeare's eyes. And that maybe from a leadership perspective, there is humility, service, and the ability to empathize with things that are not necessarily the way we see the world, without necessarily approving of them, that makes a huge difference to the characters. And I wonder with Henry, because he's been part of the Eastcheap beer and sawdust and mud, whether that also is an enormous help for him when he's dealing with Agincourt, that he's grown down as well as up. He's not just falsely elevated. That also feels like a major Shakespearean and Jungian theme to me.
Yes, absolutely. It's why I really particularly, I don't want to, appear like an advertiser for you, but I do particularly admire the inspiration that Richard Olivier, who was directing that production of Henry V, you, your good self, were playing in it with me. A number of the leaders and creators of OMA were part of that experience when we opened the Globe. And your imagination to create seemingly chaotic, forest, meaningless, pointless, experiences. I'm saying what they might appear to the very well-lit corporate mind, which is, it's so necessary in that, like a warrior, to be not wasting your time. Everything is functional, and you have a short career. It's incredibly, unless you're lucky, it's incredibly pressured. You have incredible objectives that require incredible sacrifice and work. What are we doing going off and spending a day or 5 days just with actors and pretending and in a kind of chaotic thing that might challenge and question everything? But it's the only way we'll grow. It's the only way we'll grow and create a sustainable way of being. And it's certainly, I think, the only way that I've sustained such a long career and grown is that I haven't always been brave enough to do it, but from time to time I have embraced chaos and learned something new. This is partly to do with a very, very simple, as I said at the beginning, I'm not university educated, but something did mean a lot of sense to me, which was an old pattern of how things change, the cycle of initiation. You brought in that lovely word, and I think these Shakespeare characters are initiates. They are experiences of initiation to a mystery. So that's a grand way of saying you encounter something in your life you don't know what to do anything about. It's a mystery, and how do you move through that? And that there is a pattern of desire, thought, action, stillness, desire, thought, action, stillness, which is very beautifully expressed in the seasons of spring, desire, summer, thought, autumn, action, the harvest, and winter, stillness, when the seed is planted. And it's beautifully expressed in the whole journey of a seed, which was often given to an initiate, that you planted that seed, you watered it, and saw it leaf, you gave it light, you saw it flower, and then in the autumn it harvested a fruit, wisdom, and you harvested that fruit and killed the plant, and buried some of the seeds for the next cycle to begin. And that cycle also became expressed in Christianity as faith, hope, and charity. And that gradually that cycle can, if that cycle is, if you learn from that cycle, and it's something that's very, in the Shakespeare plays, it will always be what I'll do, in that I'll have an action or something that a character says. I will try and go back to the summer before that action and think, what are the thoughts that are behind that action? And then I'll try and go beyond those thoughts and say, now what's the desire that doesn't have any form that's inside that thought? And that process, I might now feel thirsty. That appetite rises from where? I don't know, from my body. I'll think, well, here's my glass of water right here. I'll take an action, have a glass of water, drink of water. Larger, and then there are larger patterns like this going in our life. So I would constantly be working with this in the play. In a play like Hamlet, there's chaos at the beginning. In fact, I think the early version of, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. The first quarter actually has the word chaos there. He's in a kind of chaos of not knowing what to do. Then his father comes as a ghost, and he has this burning desire for revenge. And he thinks, well, how am I going to achieve that revenge? And he's lost for quite a period in chaos and pretends or is mad. Then he does act, and he kills the wrong person, Polonius, and he's banished and sent to his death. There's a whole cycle of desire, thought, action over 3 or 4 acts. And when he comes back, he goes through the cycle again. So being aware of these cycles, being aware that you're not stuck ever, you're always moving. And like with a gear, if the large movement blocks, then go back and do little gears, little movements, little desire, thought, action. When you're very depressed, just eating well and getting up and having a walk can be helpful to get you through. You see a little achievable cycles of change. But coming back to service, you see if that cycle starts to have love in it, and by love I mean that the boundaries between who we are and what we are not, get broken down, so that the other keeps, our sense of ourself keeps enlarging. That's what I mean by love, that we are connected, we are part of this whole thing of being alive on this planet, with each other human being, with each animal, each plant, each mineral, each breath we take. All ideas of separation are human-made ideas. There's no guidebook, there's no manual that says everything is separate. There's not even a rule anyway that says 1 + 1 = 2. No, because maybe there's only ever one thing. Everything is just one. So the more we're moving to that sense of connection with everything, the more our desires can have faith that what happens will be good. And if our desires have love in them, they have faith. And if our thoughts are inspired by loving desire, so if I'm thinking about you, Ben, and I think of you not as someone separate from me, someone I want to control or do it, it's a separate thing, but someone just like me. You're individual. You're not exactly like me, but we are one. And I think I feel about you that way. Then I'm more likely to think about you in a more empathetic and clever way, in a way that has understanding. And so my understanding will then have hope. If your thoughts and your desires have faith and hope in them, hope for good, because they're moved with love, then your actions will have charity. And so that's why the early Christians called it faith, hope, and charity. And there we come to service, really, service in benefit to life. And that's what's being called on us now in all fields, isn't it? In our need for biodiversity, our need for a reconnection, a restoration of ecological life on the planet, which is what the UN is naming this next decade to be about on many, many fronts. And this is something I think that Shakespeare can give us great guidance and great experience of, how to have these marvelous moments of breakthrough from our idea of that we're all separate and move into a life of interbeing and interconnectedness. Which doesn't mean we lose our individuality, but that we're not seeking to control the rest of life around us as if it doesn't have its own individuality and right as well.
Mark, that's a beautiful place for us to wind this up. I think it's a huge leadership theme as well as Shakespearean theme, I have to say. You and I have had evenings where we've spoken like this for 20 years. I hope it's been as engaging for others as it always is for me. We often have huge pauses after we've asked a question and lots of thinking, but it's been a real pleasure to have your insight into this. And I think it, like as all things with Shakespeare, which is what we passionately believe in our company, this goes way beyond the Shakespearean canon into what Shakespeare seemed to be really interested in, which was human life, love, service, and something that goes beyond self-service to a greater encompassing. Thank you so much for doing this, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Well, I really, really, really appreciate the work you're doing, and I think I think the author is speaking very specifically to the princesses and the princes and the kings and queens within each of us. There's something, enjoyable and sensual and beautiful in the plays, but undoubtedly there is a concern there and a love for the emerging prince and the emerging princess. They are time and again the heroines and heroes and initiates in the plays, and they are a part of all of us, and they struggle often under a dominating king or ruler within our psyche, moment by moment, day by day, year by year. They need assistance to emerge, because they really are the next leader, and that's a very important aspect, isn't it? The young leaders. So to help them and give them spaces to go out into the forest and to experience great battles without dying, and this is a great service, and I hope that it reaches out to all the unknown princes and princesses. It's so funny you talking in your description of me at the beginning as a figure of importance or something, in your life as a young actor, that you were nervous to come and meet me, and it meant something that I'd asked you to audition. You see, I had no impression of myself that way. I at that age or earlier, I felt so powerless and cast into things way beyond my ability, and very aware of these powerful kings Sir Peter Hall and Trevor Nunn and different people who were running institutions. And it's such a surprise to me still to have emerged, you know, and be emerging constantly from the unknown prince into someone that people look to as a mentor or as a wise person or as someone who, yes, has been a king in my time of certain organizations, but has an emerging king. I don't mean that in a grand way, but just in someone who's been through a series of experiences. So to the young people watching who feel, well, this isn't for me, I'm no prince, I'm no princess, watch out, watch out. If you've had any contact with OMA, even in a dark place or a forest, and as it seemed, what's that to me, it's still come in there. You got a prince and a princess in you, everyone does. And they need love and support.
I couldn't agree more. And just to say, Mark, the fact that you were so unaware of that was the reason why so many of us were so keen to work with you, because that kind of humility is something that's all too rare and is potentially a vital leadership theme, and certainly seemingly a great Shakespearean theme. Mark, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for doing this, and we wish you well.
Thank you, Ben.